They executed her father at dawn. She didn't see the blade fall, she only heard the cannon, a single. Thunderous boom rolled through the stone walls of her prison, echoing like judgment. 14 years old, barefoot on a damp floor. Marie Thérèse Charlotte stood still, her back pressed to a cell that smelled of rust and rot. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She already knew what the cannon meant. The King of France was dead, and now she was no one. A year before, she lived in Versailles under gilded ceilings, surrounded by tutors, court musicians, and the strict rituals of royal life. She wore silk, spoke fluent Italian and German, and was taught to kneel properly before altars and emperors. Then the gates of the palace broke open. Crowds poured in, fists raised, chanting death. They dragged her family to Paris like prisoners. Her brother, just a boy, was declared king by royalists, but locked in a cell and forgotten. Her mother, Queen Marie Antoinette, held her daughter's hand one final time before being taken to execution. The crowd jeered as the cart passed. Blood soaked the streets. Now she was alone. No letters. No voices. The guards called her the orphan. Sometimes they passed her food through a slot. Sometimes they didn't. There was no trial. No date. No future. She scratched names into the walls, Louis. Marie. Charles, until her fingers bled. The nights were cold, and the silence more brutal than chains. She survived by memory, by ritual, by refusing to forget. They wanted her broken. They expected her to vanish, the way the rest of her bloodline had. But she remained, the last heartbeat of a dynasty built on centuries of power and shattered in months of violence. Her name was erased from documents, her story pushed into footnotes, but she was still there, staring out from behind the iron bars, waiting for someone to remember that she existed. She didn't choose to become the last princess of France. She survived it. ChatGPT John Noy at the Palace of Versailles. Everything shimmered. The chandeliers above the Hall of Mirrors flickered with candlelight. Fountains outside danced to music composed for the king in one of those marble rooms. Marie Thérèse Charlotte was born on December 19, 1778, daughter of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, baptized under ceilings painted with angels and gods. She was called Madame Royale, and before she could walk, she had a title, a household of servants, and a future already planned by blood. The court raised her to be the perfect princess. She learned languages before she learned how to braid her hair. Italian, Latin, German, Spanish. She could read and write them all. History lessons weren't just about the past. They were about her inheritance. Her tutors reminded her daily she carried the dignity of Bourbon blood. Her walk was practiced. Her voice was trained. Her life was measured in protocol. Even how she smiled had to follow the etiquette of empire. But inside the palace, the perfection was thinning. Her baby sister, Sophie, died at barely a year old. Her brother, Louis Joseph, the heir to the throne, suffered from a curved spine and coughed blood into white handkerchiefs. The court doctors applied leeches and prayers, but it didn't help. At age 7, he died in his sleep. Marie Thérèse's world didn't collapse that day, but a crack ran through it, and it would never stop spreading. Outside the palace gates, the air was changing. Bread lines stretched through Paris. Pamphlets flooded the streets, accusing the queen of wasting tax money while mothers starved. Cartoons mocked the king's weight, the queen's fashion, the royal children's faces. Marie Thérèse was only 10, but even she noticed the stairs during carriage rides had shifted. People didn't bow as low, some didn't bow at all. Her mother told her not to be afraid, that the people would calm, that they only needed time. They were wrong. On July 14, 1789, the Bastille fell. Rumors flooded Versailles before the news did. Servants whispered about the mobs. Soldiers vanished from their posts. Marie Antoinette wept behind locked doors. Louis XIX tried to hold court like nothing was happening. That night, Marie Thérèse stayed awake, listening for sounds in the hallway. She didn't understand the words yet. Uprising, guillotine, republic, but she could feel something familiar shattering. 3 months later, it came. Thousands marched on Versailles in the rain, women in aprons and men with muskets. They broke the palace gates. They demanded bread. Then they demanded blood. The royal guards were slaughtered. Their heads were placed on pikes. Marie Thérèse was 11. She clung to her mother's skirts as they were marched out of Versailles at sword point. Behind them, the palace glowed like a dying star. They weren't taken to a dungeon, not yet. They were moved into the Tuileries Palace in the center of Paris. It was grand, but cold. More fortress than home. Guards stood outside every door. The queen's jewelry was confiscated. The servants were dismissed. The family was watched day and night. Marie Thérèse still had gowns and books, but the air smelled different. The windows were locked. The laughter was gone. She began to understand that they were not just guests in Paris. They were prisoners. Then came Varennes. In June 1791, the king tried to escape. The plan was simple: ride through the countryside disguised as commoners, reach Austria, and call for allies. But the plan failed. A postmaster recognized the king from a coin. The family was stopped, dragged from the carriage by torchlight, and marched back to Paris under armed guard. Crowds spit at them as they passed. The queen's hair turned white. Marie Thérèse never forgot the sound of the wheels over gravel as thousands screamed traitor. When they returned to the Tuileries, the gates were locked tighter. Her brother, Louis Charles, now the new heir, clung to her hand. He was only 6. He asked if they would die. She didn't know how to answer. For a year, the pressure mounted. The revolution grew louder, angrier. The king's vetoes were ignored. Revolutionary newspapers called for trials. Then came August 10, 1792. The people stormed the Tuileries, this time. They didn't just threaten, they acted. Guards were killed. The family hid behind furniture. Blood spilled in the corridors. By nightfall, the monarchy was dead. The National Assembly stripped Louis XVI of all titles. France was no longer a kingdom. Marie Thérèse and her family were moved again, this time to the Temple prison, a medieval tower with thick stone walls and iron doors. There were no tapestries, no servants, no ceremony. Her bed was straw. Her meals were thin soup. The only light came through a narrow slit too high to reach. The queen tried to maintain rituals, reading aloud, keeping lessons, but even she was unraveling. They were allowed no visitors. Their names were no longer spoken in public. On January 24, 1793, the cannon fired. Marie Thérèse had woken early that day. Her father had been taken from the room days before. She was told it was for a trial. She knew it was for a death, when the cannon roared from the Place de la Révolution. She didn't need to ask. The silence that followed was an answer. The girl who had once been called Madame Royale stood inside a stone prison cell. Her title was gone. Her family was disappearing. And her childhood had ended. Not with a fall, but with the sound of a distant gun. ChatGPT John Noy. The cannon marked the end of her father. The silence afterward marked the end of everything else. In the Temple prison, Marie Thérèse didn't cry. She sat by the wall where she'd etched the names of her family with a broken hairpin, running her fingers over each letter like a ritual. Her world was shrinking by the hour. Her mother's cell was just below hers. Yet they were not allowed to speak. When they tried, the guards slammed their rifle butts against the doors. Marie Thérèse was told nothing. She listened instead. The footsteps on the stairs, the metal clank of keys, the scrape of boots across stone. That was how she tracked time. That was how she knew something was coming. In July 1793, they came for her brother. Louis Charles was 8. His voice still echoed with childish fear. But that didn't protect him. The guards took him in the middle of the night. Marie Antoinette fought them until they dragged her away. Marie Thérèse never saw her brother again. At first, she hoped he had been moved somewhere safe. Then she started hearing rumors that he was being kept in solitary confinement, that he was being questioned, that they were trying to make him accuse their mother. She didn't believe it until she heard what he'd said. They made him sign a confession, claiming that his mother had abused him, that she had corrupted him. It was a lie. Everyone knew it. But it was printed in the newspapers anyway. The Queen was put on trial. The verdict was predetermined. On October 16, 1793, she was taken to the guillotine. No farewell was allowed, no last message. She was dressed in a plain white gown, her hands bound, her hair cut off. They say she walked to her death with dignity, without looking back. Marie Thérèse didn't know the hour, but she knew the moment. The prison grew quiet. Even the guards seemed to move slower. Later, she was told her mother had stepped on the executioner's foot and apologized before laying her head on the block. Now, there were only two left, Marie Thérèse and her aunt, Madame Elizabeth, the king's sister. They were moved to different cells. The girl was 17 now. She had lived through 6 years of revolt, 3 relocations, 1 public humiliation, and the slow erasure of everyone she loved. The walls felt like they were closing in. Food came less frequently. The guards no longer bothered with formalities. They made jokes outside her door. They called her a ghost. She didn't speak back. She barely spoke at all. In May 1794, they came again. Madame Elizabeth was taken. She left behind a note scrawled on torn paper, telling her niece to be brave. She asked her to forgive. That was the last message Marie Thérèse ever received from her family. Her aunt was executed without ceremony. Her body was dumped in a mass grave. After that, no one came. Days blurred, then weeks, then months. The girl stopped counting. Her window showed only sky. She marked the walls with lines until she ran out of space. She heard nothing from the outside, only the wind through stone. She didn't know whether France was still at war. She didn't know who ruled the streets. Sometimes she imagined she'd been forgotten entirely, that the world had moved on without her, that she would die in that room and no one would notice. In July 1794, the doors unlocked. There were no announcements, no explanations. A new set of guards appeared. The atmosphere shifted. They addressed her by name. They offered her food, clean clothes. A doctor visited. A priest was allowed in. Then came the officials. They said she would be released. Her 18th birthday was approaching. A prisoner exchange had been arranged. The Austrian court had demanded her freedom. The revolution, it seemed, had changed again. She walked out of the temple in silence. The streets looked different, colder, dirtier. She didn't look behind her. She was led to the border under heavy guard, placed in a carriage, and handed over to Austrian diplomats. Her hair was thin, her eyes hollow, her voice low. She hadn't spoken to another woman in over a year. Her French was stiff, her body had shrunk, but she was still Marie Thérèse Charlotte, and she had survived. Not because she was stronger, not because she was luckier, but because she was left for last. What waited for her beyond the border wasn't home. It wasn't family. It was exile. Diplomats who spoke in coded language, distant relatives with political agendas, courtiers who viewed her as a symbol, a survivor, a burden, a mystery. She didn't cry when they handed her a mirror. She just stared at the reflection. The girl from Versailles was gone. The child who held her brother's hand was gone. The daughter who whispered prayers to the walls of a stone prison was all that remained. The carriage that carried her across the French border was silent inside. No one spoke. The driver didn't make eye contact. The soldiers escorting her never addressed her directly. Marie Thérèse Charlotte sat still, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the countryside pass like a fading dream. Every tree, every village, every mile of road was both familiar and alien. It was the land she had once belonged to. It was now the land that had orphaned her. When she arrived in Austria, there were no parades, no open arms, only courtiers in powdered wigs and rehearsed sympathy. They referred to her as Madame Royale. But she could hear the weight behind their voices. She was a living reminder of a dead monarchy, a vessel of trauma, a political complication wearing a tiara. Her uncle, Emperor Francis II, met her with distant courtesy. He had once written affectionate letters to his sister, Marie Antoinette. Now, with her gone, Marie Thérèse was a legacy he couldn't afford to ignore, but didn't know how to embrace. In Vienna, she was given an apartment in the Hofburg Palace. It was richly furnished but cold. The halls were quiet, the servants respectful, but formal. She had clothes, meals, and safety. But there were no real conversations, no familiar faces. She spent hours in silence, walking the marble corridors, memorizing the steps to avoid thinking. She didn't sleep well. When she did, her dreams were filled with screaming and locked doors. She spoke only when necessary. The past clung to her like a second skin. Everything in Vienna reminded her of what she'd lost. Paintings of ancestors she could no longer name. Conversations in rooms where her mother once danced. She was both present and invisible, surrounded by ghosts she couldn't escape. She carried with her a small wooden box containing what little she'd salvaged a ribbon from her mother's hair, a miniature portrait of her brother, a blood-stained handkerchief that had once been white. The Austrians tried to marry her off. Every proposal came with a title, a territory, a treaty. She rejected them all. They didn't understand. She wasn't waiting for love. She was guarding a memory. Then came Louis Antoine, Duke of Angoulême. He was her cousin. He had escaped the revolution and grown up in exile. Their marriage was more arrangement than romance, but it offered her something she hadn't had in years, a familiar name, a shared silence, and the illusion of continuity. They were married in 1799. As the wife of a Bourbon prince, she returned to a different kind of captivity. Protocol replaced prison walls. Her days were scheduled to the minute mass. Letters, audiences, sewing, walks, silence. There was no room for grief, no room for questions. She played her role, dutiful, polished, silent, but nothing felt real. She never had children. Doctors gave no explanation. Some whispered that trauma had left her barren. Others said she had simply willed herself into stillness. Years passed. Regimes shifted. Napoleon rose, fell, returned, and was finally defeated. In 1814, with the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, she returned to France. It had been 2 decades. The gates of Paris opened once more. She entered the city not as a child of Versailles, but as a ghost of its ruin. The people cheered. The flags flew. But behind the applause, she saw the same streets where her family had been led to execution, the same balconies where the crowds had chanted for blood. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She refused to visit the temple. She refused to set foot in the Tuileries. She ordered her carriage to turn away whenever it neared those streets. In public, she wore black. At court, she spoke little. When asked about her childhood, she answered with silence. Her husband was named heir to the throne, and she was now technically queen in waiting. But there was no celebration, no joy, only the weight of a crown shaped by loss. Then came 1830. Revolution returned like a recurring nightmare. Her father-in-law, King Charles VI, was overthrown. Her husband abdicated. The Bourbon monarchy collapsed once more. This time, there was no arrest, no trial, only exile. Quiet, efficient, final. She left France for the last time. They settled in Edinburgh, then Prague, then finally Frosdorf in Austria. The house was large, surrounded by forest. She planted flowers that didn't grow. She kept candles lit in rooms no one entered. She copied pages from the Bible in careful handwriting. She insisted on court rituals long after they'd lost their meaning. Every chair had a proper place, every greeting a correct form. Visitors said she lived like a shadow trapped in ceremony. She spent her last years preserving boxes of letters, locks of hair, bits of lace. She refused modern comforts. She ate simply, spoke softly, and moved through the halls like she was still being watched. She kept a portrait of her mother above her desk, and a faded pair of her father's gloves in a drawer she never let the maids touch. She never returned to Paris. She never reclaimed her title. She never wrote a memoir. She said little, but she remembered everything. At Frosdorf, the silence became part of her. The house was large, but never felt full. Marie Thérèse Charlotte filled it with order, not people. Her routines were precise. She woke early, dressed with the help of attendants who rarely spoke first, walked the gardens regardless of weather, and ended each evening in prayer beneath portraits of the dead. She wasn't a queen. She wasn't a prisoner. She was something in between, alive, but claimed by a past that refused to fade. She preserved everything. Letters from her parents, faded with age, locks of her brother's hair, carefully sealed, a lace collar stained with blood, wrapped in linen. Her rooms were curated like shrines. The furniture was arranged to match what she remembered from Versailles. Chairs placed just so, curtains pulled to the exact height her mother preferred. She wrote down court etiquette from memory, organizing it into volumes no one would read. To outsiders, it seemed obsessive. To her, it was survival. She received visitors rarely. When she did, they were struck by how little she changed. Her face was aged, but her posture remained regal. Her clothes were always black. She spoke formally, even in private. Her voice never rose. She asked few questions. Her interest in the outside world was minimal. She read newspapers, but only the headlines. She responded to letters, but never shared stories. When asked about her time in prison, she gave no details. When asked about her mother, she offered only a single phrase. She walked with dignity. She lived with rituals that no longer belonged to any living court. She insisted on royal forms of address. She maintained the etiquette of a France that no longer existed. Her attendants called her Madame. Guests bowed. Meals were served in courses, with silver cutlery and porcelain from Sèvres. No one dared touch her belongings. No one questioned her silence. But the past found ways to speak. In 1837, a woman appeared in Berlin claiming to be the real Marie Thérèse. She said she had escaped from prison, been hidden by loyalists, and smuggled out under a false name. She claimed the girl who left the temple was an imposter. Her story spread fast. Pamphlets were printed. Newspapers picked it up. Supporters appeared. She called herself Dark Countess, and she refused to speak in public. She wore veils, avoided cameras, and lived in seclusion for years. People whispered that maybe the real princess had died in the temple, that maybe the woman in Frosdorf was a decoy, a substitute raised to keep peace. Marie Thérèse never addressed the rumor directly. She refused interviews. She offered no defense. But her health declined. She stopped walking the gardens. She spent more time in her rooms, surrounded by the past. Some said the rumor didn't anger her. It broke her. She had built her life on memory, on being the one who remembered. Now, people questioned if those memories were even hers. Still, she held on to her rituals. She prayed every night. She touched her father's gloves before bed. She wore a locket with her mother's initials. She kept her hair braided the way it had been in Versailles. Decades earlier, she spoke to the portraits. She spoke to the silence. She died on October 19, 1851. No monarchs attended her funeral. No crowds lined the roads. She was buried in a quiet cemetery near Frosdorf. Next to her husband, her coffin was simple. Her epitaph read only, daughter of Louis Wandon and Marie Antoinette. It didn't mention her suffering. It didn't mention the prison. It didn't mention the child who lived through the end of a kingdom and never truly left its ruins. But those who stood at her grave said her face, in death, looked peaceful, as if she had finally returned somewhere familiar, as if the silence had at last answered. Marie Thérèse Charlotte was never formally crowned, but she wore the weight of royalty longer than any sovereign of her generation, not in titles, but in silence, in her presence, in the way rooms shifted when she entered. She never had a throne. She had a memory, and that was heavier. She lived through the destruction of a monarchy and the resurrection of its myth. She watched her family's name become both a symbol of tyranny and a rallying cry for restoration. In the salons of Vienna and the drawing rooms of London, they debated her mother's excesses, her father's failures, and her own survival. She was spoken of, never spoken to. She existed more as a relic than a person. Even as years passed, her name summoned judgment. To royalists, she was the living link to a divine right that could be reclaimed. To Republicans, she was the last gasp of a regime that deserved to die. To historians, she became a contradiction too silent to fully understand, too visible to forget. She had outlived the court that raised her, the revolution that destroyed it, and the men who tried to rebuild both. Yet her story resisted simplicity. She didn't write memoirs. She left no public confessions. Her documents were sparse, her letters formal. What remained were fragments, pages from her childhood books, scribbled notes in margins, corrected prayers, private rituals. The life she preserved was not for the public. It was an archive of grief, curated behind closed doors. She had opportunities to step into the spotlight. She was offered positions at court, ceremonial roles, even brief chances to return to France in a symbolic capacity. She declined each one. When monarchies were re-established across Europe after Napoleon, she remained in the background when the Bourbon Restoration briefly returned her family to power. She attended state functions without comment, her eyes downcast, her responses measured. She knew better than anyone what applause could turn into. No portraits were commissioned in her later years. She refused most artists. The few that exist show a woman composed but distant, often dressed in black, seated in spaces that echo nothing of the grandeur she was born into. Her hands rest still, her face unreadable. There is dignity, but it's guarded. No smile, no softness, only control. She was not universally loved. In conservative circles, her devotion to the old codes felt out of time, even obsessive. Among liberals, her refusal to condemn the Ancien Regime made her suspect, even among surviving nobles. She remained a figure apart. Her trauma had carved her into something they couldn't reach. A royal, yes, but of a vanished world. Despite that distance, people studied her. They speculated about her health, her habits, her faith. They wondered what she whispered during prayer, whether she forgave the people who killed her family, whether she truly believed in the monarchy, or simply had nothing else left to believe in. They searched for scandal. There was none, only stillness. The question of identity never faded. The story of the Dark Countess lingered in the public mind. Books were written, theories were published. Some claimed the real Marie Thérèse died in prison, replaced by a double to save diplomatic embarrassment. They dissected handwriting, analyzed silhouettes, compared bone structures. She never addressed it. Not once. Her silence, as always, became its own kind of verdict. She allowed herself one indulgence, a private chapel inside the estate. No audience, no priests, just candles and quiet. The windows were stained glass depictions of the Virgin Mary, the Sacred Heart, and Saint Elizabeth. In one corner stood a small wooden cross. In front of it, a kneeling cushion worn thin. That was where she went every evening. Alone. Her servants said she never raised her voice, never gave orders in anger. She was exacting, not cruel. She expected perfection, but she accepted human failure. She corrected mistakes with patience, then turned away. The only time she showed visible emotion was when a maid once dropped a bundle of letters by accident. She didn't shout, she didn't cry, she simply picked them up herself, hands trembling, and locked them away. She died without ceremony. No national mourning, no public procession. Her passing was noted in small paragraphs in European papers, often mispronouncing her name, often confusing her titles. They called her a duchess, a Bourbon widow, a forgotten princess. They missed the truth. Marie Thérèse Charlotte was the last vessel of a broken crown. She didn't try to rebuild it. She didn't avenge it. She carried it, quietly, relentlessly, until her last breath, and when she was gone. So too was the last voice that remembered the sound of Versailles before the storm. ChatGPT John Noy. She lived in a world that no longer recognized her, yet she never stopped moving through it, as if it might return. Marie Thérèse Charlotte refused to abandon the rituals of her vanished monarchy, not out of nostalgia, but out of necessity. Rituals were the architecture of her survival, in the absence of a family, of a throne, of a home unshaken by violence. She held on to formality like it was the last stable pillar in a crumbling cathedral. At Frosdorf, the days passed like echoes. She maintained a rigid daily routine. Breakfast was served at the same hour. Prayer came before any conversation. No one addressed her without protocol. The tapestries in the halls weren't changed. The candles were lit, even when the rooms stood empty. Her world remained fixed. Even as history moved on without her, she never wrote about her past, but it lived inside everything she did. Her handwriting stayed neat and ceremonial. Her wardrobe contained no bright colors. The paper she used was always the same parchment stock, imported from France, sealed in the same red wax her mother once favored. Her rooms were scented with lavender, just like Versailles, and no matter the season. The fireplace in her study was kept burning. Visitors noted that her surroundings felt less like a home and more like a museum constructed by memory itself. Nothing was accidental, nothing out of place. Every object, every gesture, was a tether to a time that no longer existed. She kept a locked drawer of items that no servant was ever permitted to touch. Inside were fragments of her past, a dried sprig of rosemary, a child's silver spoon, a piece of ribbon embroidered with her mother's initials. These were not sentimental tokens. They were proofs, evidence that what she remembered had once been real, after years of denial, rumors, false histories, and public doubt. She needed something to affirm that her life had not been imagined, that her suffering had been witnessed by more than her own mind, that she had not disappeared into silence for nothing. Despite her isolation, news from the outside still reached her. She read about France becoming a republic again, about more kings falling, about revolutions across Europe. Each headline marked a confirmation of the lesson she had learned. Too young. Power is not inherited. It is taken. And once taken, it cannot be trusted to return. She said nothing publicly. Her opinions were shared only in letters to the few who had earned her trust. And even those were measured, distant, as if written by someone observing the world from behind a wall of glass. She refused to engage in nostalgia. She never spoke of balls, or gardens, or music. When asked about Versailles, she replied only that it had been too quiet. Even then, she had no illusions about the failures of her family. She understood the privilege she had been born into, but she also understood what had been done to her, what had been done to children, to innocents, to those who had not yet chosen a side. She didn't grieve the throne. She grieved what people were willing to do in the name of progress, what justice had become once vengeance wore its mask. In her final years, she began sleeping less. She would rise before dawn and sit by her window for hours, staring at the horizon as if searching for something she'd forgotten. Her attendants worried about her health. She dismissed their concern with a wave of the hand. She had lived long enough, she told them, long enough to remember too much. Her memory had outlived her family, her titles, and the world she had been trained to serve. Now it was beginning to turn on her. She once said to a priest that she feared not dying, but being erased. The people who visited her during those years described a woman both luminous and unreachable. Her eyes held history, but her words gave little away. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, her voice was soft, but her language precise, like someone who still believed words could shape the world. She gave no instructions about her legacy, no demands, no monuments. She didn't want her life rewritten or glorified. She only wanted it not to be lost. On quiet afternoons, she would sit by the fire with her dog at her feet, holding a book she rarely read. The silence was never empty for her. It was full of voices only she could still hear. She spoke to them sometimes, not in madness, but in remembrance. Names whispered like prayers, dates recited like mantras, faces summoned from the deepest part of herself. They were not ghosts. They were truths. She was the last witness. When the end came, there were no declarations. She passed in her sleep. Her breathing slowed to stillness. The candle by her bedside burned low. The book on her lap slid quietly to the floor. Her hands, folded over her chest, were wrapped in the same lace her mother once wore at court. The final silence was complete. She was buried not far from where she had lived. No state funeral, no banners, just a handful of mourners and a headstone bearing her full name. Beneath it, the dates of her birth and death. Nothing more. The rest she had carried in silence. With her, the last thread of that era snapped. The memory of a kingdom that had once commanded Europe collapsed into a single grave. But there are still those who study her face, read her letters, walk the halls she once filled with quiet precision. They do not seek royalty. They seek a story that doesn't end in coronation or conquest, but in endurance. She endured, and in doing so, she refused to disappear. History rarely pauses for those it wounds. It moves forward, loud and indifferent, leaving behind only the traces of those who endured it quietly. Marie Thérèse Charlotte left no throne, no heirs, no monuments bearing her likeness. But she left something else, an unbroken record of survival, not the kind sung in anthems or carved into marble, but the kind etched in silence, a life lived entirely after the fall, shaped not by power, but by the refusal to be erased. She outlived the revolution that killed her family. She outlived the monarchs who replaced them. She outlived the myths, the rumors, the lies, and the generations who argued about what she meant. She wasn't a queen. She was not a martyr. She was a witness, one who remembered, when remembering was the only act of defiance she had left, and because she remembered, the world cannot fully forget. What remains is not just her name or her lineage, but the undeniable presence of a life shaped by loss. The girl who stood behind stone walls and listened to cannon fire. The woman who walked through exile with a spine carved by memory. The survivor who knew the value of silence in a world desperate for noise. Her story lingers not because it is grand, but because it is real, because it asks what power looks like when stripped of gold, because it shows how some people carry the weight of history not by conquering it, but by enduring it in the end. She gave no speeches, led no armies, wore no crown, but she lived, and that, in the shadow of everything she lost, was its own kind of revolution.